May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our salvation. So the night before I was to celebrate my first Mass, which was a long time ago now, I spent hours in church practicing and praying. I was practicing what to do and what to say, when I had to lift the chalice, what hand I should use to make the sign of blessing, because there were so many things that I could get wrong, and I really wanted to get everything right. And while I practiced, I was praying like Billy O, you know, so that I'd get everything right, obviously, but I was also praying, I remember it very clearly, I was praying, Lord, please, please don't let me be a stumbling block. Don't let me be a stumbling block. Don't let me get in the way. The thing that keeps other people from experiencing your presence. Well, I have to tell you that that prayer was not answered. Not that I got anything wrong that I'm aware of. I mean, I didn't drop the host or spill blood of Christ, although I have done both since. But nevertheless, I was still a big, fat stumbling block. There were people in our church community who didn't accept women's priesthood. They wanted a male priest, and so, you know, I couldn't help but be a stumbling block because there wasn't anything I could do about me being me. And I'm sure I've often been a stumbling block for reasons other than my gender, but that particular stumbling block was just a given. There was nothing I could do about it, so I just had to live with it, and you all had to live with it too. And there was a particular couple in our community who wouldn't receive communion from me, and they didn't receive communion for 3 whole years because they had principles and they were sticking to them. And that was kind of painful, but it was also kind of beautiful because they didn't, you know, walk off in a half. They didn't, at least to my knowledge, write to the bishop and complain. They didn't refuse to come on days when I was celebrating Mass. They still carried on being very much a part of the church community, a part of my mission and ministry. And I continued to be a part of their life. And it wasn't always, you know, 100% comfortable. And then one day they stopped receiving communion, and I had not changed. I was still, you know, at least to the extent I was still like female, I was still the same me, but for some reason, I was no longer a stumbling block for them. I didn't ask why, they didn't tell me why, I was just grateful we all just carried on. Many, many, many years later, I was having lunch at the home of one of those same parishioners. And she told me she'd changed her mind. She said she hadn't changed her mind about women priests, which was still an abomination in the face of the Lord. But I was an exception. She had changed her mind about this particular woman priest, but the rest of them, no. So we got to pondering about God's love and God's call and the limitations and constrictions we try and put on it. And I kind of reflected with her on why I could be loved by God and I could be called by God. And on a good day, when I got out the way, God could use me for God's work and another woman couldn't. Like, how about maybe her, for example? And she burst into tears, and it was just the most holy and beautiful moment. Last week, Peter was called the rock upon which Christ would build his church. And this week, he is called the stumbling block, which gets in the way of the building of the church. Now, he is the same Peter this week as he was last week. As far as I'm aware, he hasn't changed. A stumbling block is still a rock. It's just a rock that's in the way. And I guess when we stumble, the question for us is, in the way of what? Way back again toward the beginning of my ministry, Canon Geoffrey John was chosen to be bishop in the Oxford Diocese. I don't know if anyone remembers this big hoo-ha. I guess it was around the early 2000s, I don't know, 2003, 4, 5, somewhere around that. Anyway, all hell broke loose. And a few weeks later, after many protests and much unpleasantness, Geoffrey stood down. He had been persuaded that if he did indeed take up his post as bishop, he would be a stumbling block in the path of church unity. Geoffrey is gay. If Geoffrey had become a bishop in the Oxford Diocese, he may well have been a stumbling block to church unity. But then again, he probably also would have been a rock on which a more inclusive and just and Christ-shaped church could be built. Maybe, in the words of James Finley, what was in the way was the way. Perhaps the only time we stop to think about whether the path that we're headed pell-mell down is really the path God is calling us down, or some other path entirely, is when we stumble. No one likes to stumble. They hurt, they trip us up, we fall, we don't like it. But the fact is we need them. The times of greatest growth in my life have been the times when I have fallen flat on my face. When I have stumbled and tripped and when the path seems blocked. No one wants to trip and fall. No one wants to be the person who makes someone else trip and fall, particularly not, you know, the whole of the church and its unity. That sometimes we need a stumbling block and sometimes we need to be the stumbling block. And sometimes the ones of us who are stumbling and the ones of us who are being stumbled over need to stop and reflect. It feels like for pretty much the whole world at the moment, individually and collectively, the path that we thought was open before us is now full of obstacles. That stumbling blocks are strewn in our path. And perhaps it's time not to try and move them out of the way, not to rebuke them, not to climb over them or, you know, blast them, but to think about the path we're actually headed down. Whether it's the right path, whether it's a cross-shaped path, a path that has its suffering and its struggles, but which is broad enough for all God's children to follow. Whether what is in the way maybe is the way.